Yeah, let me let him in right now.
Stay in my mind for all of time. Where do I go from here? No,
Hi,
I'm
everyone. We're really happy to have you.
have no fear.
We'll start in a couple of minutes.
I'll be seeing you wherever I go. I'll be seeing you wherever I go.
Can't get enough of America.
All right. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We're really happy to have you with us today. We're going to get started. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for being here. We're going to get started. I want to introduce Liberated Ethnic Studies first. Liberated Ethnic Studies is a group of educators, activists, ethnic studies lovers, and we're here to make sure that we advocate for authentic ethnic studies. We are consisted of 6 different chapters. So our intro chapter, we have a Black Studies chapter, Chicano Latinx chapter, AAPI chapter, Native Studies chapter, and then an intersectional chapter. And this particular session today is hosted by our AAPI chapter, which I'm part of, Estella is part of, and then Danny is part of as well. So I'm going to actually pass it off to do our line acknowledgement is Danny.
Thank you, Eunice, and thank you everyone for being here. And this is Apeli Haufa and a quote, and I'm going to share why we chose this particular quote, why we chose this particular scholar. But as I'm speaking about that, could you please go to the chat and type in from where you're joining us in this Zoom meeting? And so this particular quote goes, Oceania is vast. Oceania is expanding. Oceania is hospitable and generous. Oceania is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire deeper still. Oceania is us. We are the sea. We are the ocean. And the reason why we chose this particular quote is because a lot of the dominant position about us is viewed from a position of power. And because our lands that we live on is relatively small to the larger continental masses, there are significant consequences to having our people having this self-image. It's a belittling view of indigenous cultures from Pasifika, and it's from the early years with colonizers and interactions with Europeans. And it's a popular to think that our island homes are small and we don't have too much resources. We're too isolated, and that our places from where we're from, we're unable to rise above. However, this kind of overlooks who we are as people, our history of people, and they view us from just our land area. But our people historically saw our land, but we also saw the ocean, and as far as we could travel those oceans. We saw below the oceans, and the energies that it creates to make new land, and also the powers, and appreciate the powers that move that land. We also looked up into the skies for the powerful winds and the stars and the planets and all the things that we use to travel across the seas. And we chose this particular quote because the history of our people is a lot larger than how the dominant colonizers looked at us. So with that, I'll pass it back to Eunice. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I'm going to have Estella do our ancestor acknowledgement.
Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Liberated session today, centering Pasifika narratives and solidarity within our ethnic studies movement. Well, first introduce myself, Estella Owima Church, pronounced she, her, executive director of EPIC and member of Liberated. EPIC is also in support of not only ethnic studies, but tonight's gathering. And so you have info on EPIC, and I'll drop links in the chat throughout our session today. But EPIC is a pro-Black, pro-Indigenous, and anti-racist national organization based in Los Angeles that was established in 2009 to advance social justice through culturally centered advocacy, leadership development, research, and narrative change. And our ancestor that we want to bring into the space, along with the rest of our ancestors and acknowledge this evening, is Teresia Tewa, who says, or is famously quoted, "We sweat and cry salt water, so we know that the ocean is really in our blood." And she, for me in particular, as someone who identifies as Black Pasifika, her work has been absolutely not just profound, but grounding, more so than I think any other emotion or word I could use to describe her work. It is also the beginning of Samoan Language Week, and just wanted to throw that out. And as we close Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, so much of who we are is also our names, is also our lands, our ancestral homelands. It is also our genealogies and cosmologies, and it's also the lands that have raised us, maybe in diaspora, away from those ancestral lands. And so her work reminds me of that. That quote in particular reminds me of that. And so I offer it to share with everyone else. And I'll drop in the chat a piece of hers about land and the link to EPIC site. And with that, I will go ahead and move on to our cultural energizer. And so next slide, thank you. Also from our ancestor, Teresia Tewa, she has a piece called Classroom as a Canoe, and it is an amazing article. I recently left the classroom after 10 years of service. And one of the biggest lessons I learned, especially as an ethnic studies educator and champion, is that you absolutely, in this work, whether you are K-12 or higher ed, must be able to find your people, your crew, your village, the folks who are going to be your co-conspirators when you are in PDs at your school site and folks are saying some real wild, off-the-wall stuff, and you're trying to figure out who in this multi-purpose room feels the same way I feel, and are not okay with the way our kids are being treated or being denied access to all of the windows, mirrors, and sliding doors that they absolutely deserve to have access to in a classroom. All the things that ethnic studies provides our students. So in the chat, I would love it if you can share, if you're thinking about your classroom as a canoe, your learning space, your organization, who are your people? Who are the crew of folks that are navigating this canoe alongside you? And then what's the cargo? Those those canoes that got our folks across and all around the ocean from island to island also brought along with them plants and other things to sustain our folks that would travel well on those canoes and make it to the next island. And so thinking about your classroom as a canoe, what cargo are you bringing with you on your canoe? So who are your people? And what is absolutely essential to the voyage? Who are your people and what is absolutely essential to your voyage? You can access that full article using that QR code. And then, yeah, I'll leave that up just for a second while folks are still coming into the room and introducing themselves in the chat. And I am just checking the chats. Thank you, thank you. My people are BIPOC students and colleagues. Self-determination and liberation are essential for the voyage. My people are liberated folks. Love and solidarity are essential for the voyage. Thank you, thank you. All righty. I'm gonna go ahead and move us forward to critical concepts. And I, to be honest, want to be super brief for the next 3 slides. I just want to provide some context, and then I want to get to the meat of this session, which is our amazing panelists who have joined us today to talk about what it looks like to really center PI Oceania Studies in our greater movement for ethnic studies as a collective. And so, yeah, next slide. Thank you, Eunice. So this slide here just gives a really brief visual of when we're talking about Pasifika or the Pacific, what nations that includes. And I do also think it's really important to point out that many of our identities are very much connected to the ways our islands have been impacted by colonial structures, empires, colonialism overall. And even as we celebrate NHPI Heritage Month, recognizing that those terms did not originate within or from our communities, and were actually given to us and to our communities. And when we talk about the Pacific, it's also very important to make sure that in any racial justice work, we're doing better at censoring the most marginalized. And that means that when we're talking about the Pacific, it's elevating and amplifying our Melanesian siblings, our Micronesian siblings, and recognizing Polynesia or Native Hawaiian folks and issues tend to be the first that are visible. And so Pasifika or Oceania, it is all of those regions, or Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. It includes our COFA migrants, so compacted free associated nations, which includes Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. We have our US nationals, which includes America Samoa, those who are considered US citizens, which includes Guam, Hawaii, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. And then we have our folks from Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Western Samoa, Independent Samoa, Tokelau, Kiribati, and several other islands. You can access the full demographic profile and far more details on that map and more by using that QR code. Next slide, please. So again, those terms, AA, API, APIA, so on and so forth, they've changed over the years. And right now we're at AA and HPI, but that has been 3 decades plus of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community leaders and organizers advocating on behalf of community for equitable access to data and data disaggregation. Under the umbrella term AAPI, for a very long time, Pacific Islanders were not acknowledged in that category. And when it came time to surveys or things like the census, most often folks didn't always know what to check or what to choose, or were just not included or represented in the options available. And so I wanted to point out, ancestor also welcomed this ancestor into the space, and that is Hanani K. Trask, who said, "We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be American," one of her many famous quotes. And that is to say that many Native Hawaiians do not consider themselves US citizens, as many other indigenous lands is Turtle Island. These are lands that have been unceded and taken by empire, and Hawaii is no exception. And the term, or the AA and HPI umbrella term, where we're at as of now, is the Office of Management and Budget. Federal agency is currently working to update, we hope, what those categories look like for collecting racial and ethnic data, and all the fingers and toes crossed that we have some real significant changes moving forward so that all folks are able to identify themselves and find themselves, and so that we all have better access to equitable and disaggregated data moving forward. Next slide, please. And I am fangirling a little bit because I saw that she came into the session a second ago, but I also wanted to point out Critical Pacific Islands and Oceania Studies framework, so brilliantly crafted by Lee Kava and Levalasi Loion. This is a framework that does the work to center PI Oceania studies in the larger ethnic studies movement. And you can access that full framework by scanning that QR code. And I will also drop the link in the chat. And this framework highlights three, or I should say chunks, PI studies into three very important units or categories. And that is history and identity, self-determination and sovereignty, disaggregation, and solidarity. I point this framework out because oftentimes I am in spaces or on panels about Asian American studies or ethnic studies, and it gets left out. And what I'm hoping our panelists will help shed some light or insight on is what it could look like, what it should look like to truly carve out a space for PI Oceania studies, whether it's standing on its own or creating programs and pathways, or creating very distinct programs within other ethnic studies departments or in Asian American or Indigenous studies departments. But I think this is a very important document here that folks should familiarize themselves with. And again, I will drop links in the chat. And with that, I will pass it over to Eunice.
Thank you, Stella. Okay, I hope you all are excited. So I'm very excited to introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then we'll jump right in. So first we have Drew Van Vai. He's a Samoan and Tokelauan educator from the city of San Francisco, and currently an adjunct instructor at Chabot College of Hayward, where he teaches ethnic studies and is actually teaches the first course centered on Pacific Islanders. He also runs a peer mentoring program called Students Supporting Students at City College of San Francisco. We also have Francine Blacksher, who is a Chamorro Chicana educator, cultural practitioner, servant leader, who started as an educator in middle school and elementary, eventually became a coach for teachers, both new and experienced, and is currently serving as the first ever Pacific Islander equity specialist in their school district. And Francine hopes to unify and bring visibility for Pacific Islanders in all educational institutions, and has also created and is the executive director of a nonprofit called Island Grad. And finally, we have Jeremiah Satoraka, who is a lecturer in the Ethnic Studies Department at CSU Bakersfield, and currently teaches Pacific Studies, Asian American Studies, Ethnic Studies courses. And his research is currently on an emergent ocean critical race theory and increasing the visibility of queer and trans Pacific Islander activists. He received his PhD in cultural studies and social thought and education from Washington State University. So, and then finally, I want to introduce to you my good friend Danny, who is the first of his Chamorro family to attend and graduate from college. He spent his childhood in Guam, which is his family's ancestral home, and is currently a teacher in San Diego Unified at a performing arts school, and is working on the district's Ethnic Studies Advisory Committee to implement Ethnic Studies district-wide, and is also part of our LESMCC AAPI chapter. So Danny is going to take it away. He's going to be our moderator as we learn from these amazing folks in our panel. Oops.
Thank you, Eunice. And I'd like to reach out to our panelists to briefly introduce themselves as much as they feel comfortable, share your identity and the villages from where you're from. And let's start with Drew.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers of this event. Just have extreme gratitude and love for putting this together. So thank you for having me, as well as my fellow panelists. I'm Samoan and Tokelauan, to be specific, like where my family is from. My mother's from Ofu Manua in Samoa, and my dad is from Fitiuta Manua. And he's also part Tokelauan. So his family in Tokelau come from the region of Whakaofo. So I bring those villages to this space. And then I also represent myself, who was raised on Ramaytush land, also known as San Francisco. So those are the villages that I represent within the space. Again, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm excited to have this dialogue with everyone. So appreciate for being in the space.
Thank you so much, Drew. Let's hand the mic over to Jeremiah. Jeremiah, if you could be so kind as to share and introduce yourself and how much you want to share comfortably about your ethnicity and your village, and yes.
Yeah, thank you, Daddy. So my name is Jeremiah Satoraka. He, him, his pronouns. I was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington, which is also Puyallup land. My father is from American Samoa, from Tapatimu, so Tutuila. And then my mother is from South Korea. And I always tell people this when I'm doing introductions. I get two versions of how they met. According to my father, they met, or according to my mother, they met at a military ball. But my father says they met at a club. But, whatever is true, they met while my father was in the military, and eventually went to Tacoma, which is where I was born and raised. Honored to be here, and I see a lot of names that I know, so it's exciting to see this community come together. And I'll also give a shout out to the Central Valley Pacific Islander Alliance, who is another group that I work with. It's near and dear to my heart. So glad to be here and excited for the conversation.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And Francine, I know Francine might be running a little bit late. So if you are here, could you, there you are, Francine. Please, if you'd be so kind, as much as comfortable you are sharing your ethnicity and village.
Yes, thank you so much. Apologize for my field trip t-shirt and running self. Let's just say I'm always on the ground working, and our field trip just got in 2.5 hours late. So I apologize, but my name is Francine Cepeda Blackshear, and I represent that of the Chicana Chamorro communities. My Chicana side is of my mother, the Padilla Izagiri, and we come from Mexico City and Guanajuato. And I'm sorry, not Guanajuato, Chihuahua, Mexico. Sorry, I stayed in Guanajuato for a summer. And I'm also representative of the two amazing villages in Guam, Agana and Inarajan, of my two fathers that have come from those villages. And I always remind folks of the fact that I come from two dynamic ancestral backgrounds, both that of the Mexico land and the Chamorro land. Yet today I stand on Tongva land and Serrano land, specifically in the area of San Bernardino. And I believe that one of the biggest things as to why I'm here is probably because of everybody in this space and beyond. I feel like I'm able to live out some of the fruit of the major labor that has been put in through a lot of the ethnic studies, sociology, cultural studies, folks that are in this room. So I'm honored to be here. I'm grateful that I was able to get on. And I can't remember the last question you asked.
Well, why don't we start with the next? Yeah, you answered my first question, so if
Okay.
you don't mind, Francine, that we could go to our next one, and we'll start with you. What brought you to the ethnic studies space?
I think the main thing that brought me to this space was really being provided the opportunity to come to a place in my journey as an educator after 18 years, advocating and really using all my privilege, all my spaces to be able to speak up for our Pacific Islander students, parents, community, in San Bernardino, in my school district, as well as just in the communities of reach. And I truly believe also being blessed with a husband who's a professor of sociology and got his PhD in cultural studies, I was able to really take the theories of ethnic studies, a lot of the ideas of brilliant thinkers, brilliant theorists, and their work, and actually be able to be on the ground implementing that work, starting with providing access, resources, being able to just give a platform for our people. And so coming to ethnic studies, it was never about making a choice. It was always about staying connected to that work so that everything I'm doing is an honoring of the theories, the practices, that of those where ethnic studies came through. I think I have learned that ethnic studies, coming from the college setting, there was a lot of many hurdles and struggles, as well as with academic freedom, there was a lot to be said in those spaces that when it hit ground level in K through 12, there's a lot at my job in K through 12 that's still at risk. I have a position that is not guaranteed for next year. So me staying connected to the folks, the as I say, the chiefs that are making major ground in institutionalizing ethnic studies is only going to benefit me. It's only going to keep me grounded, keep me connected to the important work that I need to make sure that I remind our community what it is we need to do. When I meet with parents in their living rooms and they're giving me their Samoa moon pies, right? And the auntie's feeding me how to make sure I bring everything that I'm learning from theory into action. I'm not going to be an acclaimed theorist, not at all. I feel like, and I don't want to use any war metaphors, but I feel like I'm a soldier in the work, but I think that soldiering comes from learning from those who have made it clear what it is that our agenda is. And I have made it very clear to the students that I work with that we have to decolonize a lot of our practices. And to decolonize starts with first recognizing how we think and being honest and vulnerable. But to do that, I do a lot of engagement with students. I don't want to go into detail. I don't know if that, I want to make sure I answer that question and not go into many other questions, but I hope that answers that initial thought.
It did. Thank you so much, Francine. Let's take that same question to Drew. Drew, what brought you to ethnic studies? What was your journey like?
So, man, shout out to being a soldier. Shout out to Francine. I was with you during that. But for me, it has to do with two things. It has to do with like representation and empowerment, right? So in high school, it had to do with representation in the content that I was learning. So like my history teacher in high school, shout out Mr. Benedicto, Balboa High, class 2006, right? My junior year, he talked about American history through the lens of lands that were colonized, right? And so I feel like that's a lesson like that's centered on that has like ethnic studies approach to it, even though it was a history class, right? And so we learned about narratives like from places from Native Americans in response to things like Manifest Destiny, spaces like the Philippines, right, that was occupied by the U.S. as well. And one lesson that stuck out to me, even though it was like one day, was he talked about treaty agreements and how they were handled in American Samoa. And he only spent one day on that lesson, but like that forever stuck with me, and was just an opportunity. Like it was a moment in my life where up to that point I never really seen or heard about my community like in the realms of education, and that's kind of like that stuck with me forever. And so I was kind of like looking for that next thing, you know what I'm saying, in having that conversation. And it wouldn't happen until I got to community college, right? And so I attended City College in San Francisco, where I attempted to play on the football team over there because they were really good at that time. And when football wasn't, I didn't do well in football. It was a community of ethnic studies folks that lifted me up and empowered me. So I want to give a shout out to my first Pacific Islander professors that I was exposed at City College in San Francisco. So Dr. Fuifui Lupe Nuetolu, who took over the IDST 45 class after the previous scholar, and then following her work at City College of San Francisco, Dr. David Polita took over the program where I also took courses in ethnic studies under him, right? And so immediately, right? So the content focusing on my community, I have a community folks that are in the field of the profession, right? That are professors that I'm learning from. And then lastly, so that was kind of like the catalyst in like figuring out a major when I transferred. So when I eventually transferred, I wanted to stay away from, I wanted to branch out a little bit from ethnic studies and explore a little. So one of the recommendations was to get a bachelor's in sociology. But what ended up happening when I pursued my sociology degree at San Francisco State was a lot of the requirement courses were cross-listed in ethnic studies. And that's where I was introduced to my mentor at San Francisco State, Dr. Larry Solomon, where the subject matter of ethnic studies became more interesting as he started incorporating what it looks like in the subject of sports and the subject of comedy, right? And so those were other segments that I was able to explore within the field of ethnic studies, and it had everything to do with representation within the content, representation within the people. And then when I transferred on, it was like, what else can we explore outside of the things outside of my identity? And those things were like, saying like pop culture, like how does it come up in pop culture? And so outside of that, outside of those realms, like the conversation in my experience, for the most part within ethnic studies, has been always about community. And so there's always been like a bridge, a component of ethnic studies. So where we learn the theory, right? But it's okay, so how do we apply it to our communities, or how do we bring in our communities? And so that's been always such a pivotal thing like within my journey is to not feel like I'm leaving my community to pursue education, but they're coming with me. And with every step of me engaging in ethnic studies, I always felt like my community has been there, if not through me, uh, also having bridges that have them connected to the field of ethnic studies. And I guess I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Drew. Thank you so much. Jeremiah, same question. What was your journey that brought you to ethnic studies?
Yeah, so I think the way I'm going to talk about it is like an informal pathway, and then I think the formal pathway is a lot shorter. So, when I was growing up, I was never really introduced to ethnic studies, let alone Pacific studies. I didn't even know that Pacific scholars existed, right? But a lot of my education initially in that K-12 period came from my family, came from the church. And, that also later on down the road, I struggled with a lot, especially being, a queer person. But some of the memories that I have about, things related to ethnic studies is we had a cultural day in elementary school. And so, once a month you were encouraged to represent whatever culture you were from. And so I was really excited to rep my new Ifaikanga with my shirt that had just been made for Children's Day, which is also known as White Sunday. And so I wore it. I wore it to school, and I got made fun of the whole day, right? Because it wasn't the norm. For those of you that don't know what a Ifaikanga is, it's a wrap around. It's a formal wear, and it kind of looks like a dress. So for younger kids, especially in an urban context, if they don't know what that is, they're gonna make fun of you. So I also developed a very thick skin, being in that kind of a context. But it really hurt me because I was like, man, like I was so proud to rep this, but for everybody else, they're calling me a girl or this and that. And it wasn't until the end of the school day when we had a jump rope for heart event. And this is where you were collect money for cancer. And so at the end of the day, you were committed to doing this jump rope thing. And so it was at that event where a Samoan woman came over to me and said, I really like your A5 Ganga. It looks really good. And that really validated what, I had on. And so it was that idea of being proud of your culture, right? Nurturing that cultural identity, not being ashamed of it. On the other side, there was another time where I brought school lunch, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. My mom is Korean, and so she knows and makes really great Korean food. The one that was kimbap. It's kind of like sushi, but it's not. It's whatever ingredients you want to put in. So I brought that to school, and everybody, immediately looked at it and said, "What is that?" Because it wasn't a sandwich. It wasn't, chicken fingers. It wasn't whatever. It was something that looked foreign. But my teacher, right, stepped in and said, "Oh, I actually like kimbap. Would you mind if I had some?" Right. So that kind of validation connection was really, really important for me. But also got me to think why is it I'm being made fun of for who I am? And then trying to understand that at an elementary school level is very difficult, right? Especially if you don't have an outlet to process what's happening to you. But I think I started formalizing a lot of my awareness and analysis in a high school IB program, so a class. The International Baccalaureate, is touted as a really academically rigorous program that's, throughout the world. It was whatever. But, we had to fill out a demographic survey. And so I remember looking at the demographic survey for race, and Pacific Islander was missing. Asian was a category. And so, in my mind, I thought why is Pacific Islander not an option? So I raised my hand. Teacher came over and asked her hey, Pacific Islander is an option here. Is there any reason why? She couldn't answer it, right? But I also fit the Asian category, so she just suggested I pick that. But that got me thinking why, okay, what's going on here, right? And so it was a lot of those moments in my life, these cumulative moments that caused me to question what was happening. Why did I feel so disrespected when people didn't know what I was wearing. Why were issues of gender, sexuality, femininity, masculinity coming to my mind, especially when it's attached to clothing? Um, and so in high school, I went for the scholarship. It was called the Active Scholarship, Leadership and Scholarship Program. So they selected a cohort of students and they gave you full tuition scholarship. Um, and it was during that program, which we spent 6 months in our senior year, before we went to college together, kind of taking these classes. And it was in that space where we were able to make sense of a lot of these racialized events, right? That a lot of us had faith, but never really talked about in the classroom. We read books like Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together by Dr. Beverly Tatum, and had a lot of conversations about race, racism. So it really provided us some of the theoretical tools to understand our lived experiences. And I met a group of really awesome, friends who I'm still friends with to this day. So that impacted what I wanted to study in college. And for I feel like for a lot of immigrant kids, there's always this pressure to become a lawyer or become a doctor. One of those things. And for me, I was like, I like music. That's what I want to study. So that's what I started off with. I was a music major. I was studying piano, and then I got nervous. I was like, wait, what am I going to do with the piano degree? I have no idea. So then I went completely the other direction and said, okay, fine, I'll do pre-med. Right, and I was taking 21 credits, doing all these classes, and I hated it. Right, but Dan, we had a fall semester, spring semester, but in between we had something called dancer. So during dancer, we took one class. You met every day for a couple hours, and usually people take the fun class. They could go skiing or do bowling. I decided to take the class that sounded interesting, and it was race and ethnicity. So this race and ethnicity class was a sociology class. And that was the first time where I heard this idea that race was a social construct, right? So that really blew my mind. So I was like, wait, what are you talking about? Race is based off of your skin color, your hair color, your eyes, right? That's what race is. But that class really debunked the idea that race is connected to DNA and biology. So that opened up the whole new world for me. And then I decided, okay, sociology is the degree that I want to study. And for those of you who study sociology like Drew did, I'm sure you also bumped into a lot of problematic things about the field. Like I didn't enjoy some things. I was like, okay, well, this is probably I won't continue with this. But I love like the race and ethnicity class, social stratification, those types of things. Fast forward to this PhD program that I decided to tackle. That's when I was exposed to specific scholars like Manulali Oluli like Linda Tui White Smith. Like when these are professors who brought these texts into the classroom, and I was being introduced to folks that I did not know existed. So, that also inspired me to look more into other Pasifika and Maori, scholars, and led me to my research dissertation, which was, ocean critical race theory. But along the way, it's so amazing. I don't know, life is just, it's so interesting because you meet folks along the way that you never thought you would. So Drew was talking about, Vika, Dr. David Vika Palaita, and I also reached out to him and he ended up being a part of my dissertation committee, right? Talking about EPIC, like I had an Auntie Lua who gave me a report that EPIC and AAJ produced, right? The conscious and community base of the US Census. And it was like all these different things, these moments that came to the culmination where I was like, oh, like this is an actual field. And in my grad program, I was formally introduced to the field of ethnic studies, right? And then eventually, came upon this job to be a lecturer at UC Bakersfield's ethnic studies at that time program. And now it's a full-blown department. Yeah, actually Lua Pritchard, right? She, man, yeah, that's probably a whole new session to talk about her, but fire. So I think that all these different events, those are, I think, what I see as informal, this informal pathway. It's a part of this field of ethnic studies that didn't necessarily, formally connect it to ethnic studies, but I think it definitely had formed my experience and my understanding, and then eventual connection to be, being in this role of teaching ethnic studies and Pacific studies in particular.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Such unique journeys to ethnic studies, but yet there's some commonalities, there's some common threads that amongst the narrative. Francine, this next question is for you. And as an educator in your community and in your context, how are Pacifica stories and narratives represented, if at all, in your work?
So more recently, I think, is where I've seen our Pacifica narratives being told. And I could speak to two ways. I could speak to through my work in K through 12, and as you asked, and then I also can speak through my nonprofit, and they're two very different. They're two very different narratives that I hear. But to speak to the question you asked about K through 12, more recently, it has come up in, believe it or not, in the AA NHPI Heritage Month, where my Native American sister called me into a space that I was not represented in, or that our community was not represented in. And she knew I was in this new position. And so she brought me to this space. And in that space, the whole group, it's called a cultural work group, was created to create all the social media marketing for AA NHPI month. Well, it was AAPI month. And I would say that where I begin to see our narratives brought up is one, through that space. And thanks to Tavai for her help, because as soon as I got into that space, I already knew bring our narratives to the table, what that might entail. And or let's just say I'm always aware of the possibility of being questioned. And sure enough, I come into this space, and I know this is not the question, but I'm trying to give context to where our narratives are brought up. There's still a lot of proving. And immediately someone asked, well, I mentioned I really would like to encourage us to, if we're going to make it AAPI, can we make it AANHPI to honor that of our Native American, my Native Hawaiian brothers and sisters from the Kingdom of Hawaii. And the first question was, where does Congress approve that? And I immediately responded, well, given the stories of my community and how they speak up, I brought their narrative right in that space and was able to advocate, but use their narrative as part of why I don't need to prove no Congress. I need to just let you hear their story. So I brought their stories to the table. That's one example. I think many other narratives that I have the privilege in this role as a Pacific Islander equity specialist is with my students and with my families. And the way that they have been brought up recently is we started during COVID, Pacific Islander Advisory, where Pacific Islander families and students were coming together just initially just to talk about our needs. I just wanted to create space for us, access them if they needed support, any tutoring, any financial assistance, rental assistance, anything. So in that space, I was able to bring their stories. They were able to bring their stories. Sometimes they didn't feel safe enough to bring their stories, so they would bring them through me. So I would talk with them and then bring them up in the form of like a Google form reflection or a Jamboard reflection, or just I talked to this auntie and she has a son who's a senior and this is what's going on. So those stories came up in that space, and from that space, we created an actual in-person Pacific Islander advisory. And I also realized in creating opportunities for our folks to tell their story and for their narratives to be heard is creating cultural guidelines. So in the space of having an in-person, I didn't realize creating that space, what that would bring. I think my district is definitely forward thinking and grateful for that, yet I had to be mindful of the boundaries that are needed to create a safe space for our people. And so with cultural guidelines, we started our meetings with elders. We started with prayer. We started with hearing the voice of the Pasifika first before anyone else. And in doing that, changed the whole dynamic, which was beautiful because we had a student voice opportunity a family voice and a community voice. And let me tell you, when our students spoke, man, the narratives that came through, we didn't even get to the family voice. Like our families were like, oh, geez, I think we need to have this meeting every month. And our students were talking about stories such as when we want to do cultural presentations, we want to be in our cultural attire. A little bit to what my brother was saying earlier about coming in our authentic cultural attire and what that looks like. And sometimes that looks like not wearing a shirt and putting oil on our skin. And we want to be able to give time to speak to the story as to the land and to the island that we represent and the meaning of the song or the dance, so that we can give context to why we are dressed accordingly. So our students were big, like that came out of them. And I mean, other things like stories about how they're connecting with their educators, how they're not connecting, how they're able to be seen on campus as more than just call me when you want a luau, or themed around some island theme that is not only appropriate in our culture, but it's making our students feel belittled or needed and valued only for one purpose, and that's entertainment. Our students spoke up a lot about their stereotypes. And so it was heartfelt. It was hard to hear, although we've heard them and experienced them ourselves. Hearing them from students, seniors, juniors, sophomores, and crying. I think one that got me the most was, man, it makes me emotional to this day, was one of my Samoan boys. He got emotional when it came to him saying, Auntie Fran, I just want people to stop seeing me as someone who wants to fight everybody. Like, I'm not mean. I'm big. I hold this face. I have a reason for making sure that I let people know they can't mess with me, but I'm the most kindest person. And he's like, I'm tired of people seeing me as a threat. And that changed the game, because that helped me to understand what I need to bring into spaces for them, what types of support systems, what types of experts, cultural practitioners I need in these spaces, what kind of safe spaces I need, what type of wellness spaces I need to create. So it was huge. I mean, he got emotional in front of everybody, and our community just loved on him after that, and we continue to love on each other. So that's another opportunity I get to hear narratives. Another one has been, in my own way, I've been learning to connect with our elders and our aunties and our uncles, because they are the root to how we can connect to our students. In my position, and some of the ways I do it is when I go on field trips, I have them roll in my car. That's why I convinced my husband to give me a big car, because I have all the aunties and uncles joining me in my car. And I asked them about how they were raised, how they were raised in the islands, how they were raised here. What are they seeing? What do they value here in the States versus what they value in the islands that are missing? And I bring those stories back to our students. I bring those stories back into some of the practices and how I lead workshops or create workshops. And then also too, we have the parent and the community voice that has shown up in our spaces. We've had programming not include our students, and our parents have spoken up. And I'm so grateful. And they've spoken up and they said, you know, our numbers are different. Our funding is different. Our families are different, and therefore we need you to see us and see the unique needs of us. And I know I'm capturing it in a summary, but those are some of the stories that I get to hear, that I have the honor of hearing. We have I will say one more thing I do. I'm an educator. It's K through 12. Estella knows this. Whenever you got all these kinds of strategies, how you get stories, right? And so we use this one called gallery walk. And I put different questions up on the wall in different sections. And I had the students, along with the parents and the families and the community, as well as district folks and outside of our PI community, join in different jigsaw gallery walks, and they answered questions. And it talked about funding. It talked about our students and their needs. It talked about specifically asking them, what do they look for, and what would be a successful school that would meet the needs of PI students. And when they went around, they got to tell their story, but they also got to tell it with the folks listening to them, with different generations listening to them. And I'll end on this last one. This was my students' ideas. I often try to let my students be empowered by themselves. Like, I try to remind them, I don't need to empower you. You have to be empowered, but I will give you the access that I can. I'll break down barriers. I'll remove whatever I can with as many people I can. I will use my own hands if I have to break down a wall for you, just so that you can speak, just so you can feel empowered. And one of the things I gave them is the opportunity. I challenged them to lead some of these conversations. And one of my students came up with the opportunity to talk about their ancestors and who are your ancestors and how do they show up for you today. So my student brought that up in the space and we got to talk about it, and the stories that came from that, from folks that aren't even in our community, were able to hear. And my students who are very rooted in their families brought up their grandmas and their grandparents and where they're from. And even when they didn't know that well, I told them, just bring up what you do know. So those are some of the examples how the narratives around our students and our families and community that I get to be around show up in the work that I get to do in my school district. Thank you.
That's powerful, Francine. Thank you for sharing. Drew, the question is, in your particular context, how are Pacifica narratives represented, if at all, and what does it look like?
Again, I just think I think it's important for me as like an instructor to make sure that, like, as a a teacher in the classroom, that the content, what I'm saying, that I cover is reflective of the students that are in the space. And a lot of the ways that we gauge, or a lot of the ways I'm able to gauge like who's in the space is kind of like a Te'ewa Paulo Freire approach to, what I'm saying, to teaching is try to recognize that they come to the classroom as teachers, what I'm saying, like with lived experiences, right? And one of the major assignments that they do within the space is inspired by a lesson that was taught to me by my partner. Lossi's in the space. That's my partner. Well, she was a part of this teaching group called PEP in San Francisco. So it's Panay Pinoy Educational Partnerships that teach ethnic studies from a Filipino perspective in San Francisco Unified. And one of the first assignments that they do with a lot of their students is called the Soundtrack of Life, right? And so the Soundtrack of Life is they pick 3 songs that define three moments in their life, or it defines their past, present, and future, right? And what a better way, right, to open up the space and know who your students are than by leading with them, right, with their knowledge, and by leading with like their narratives. And so in understanding and trying to center like the classroom that focuses on right, yeah, shout out to Allison for surely. One of the ways that I'm able to do that is by viewing, by watching them present their soundtracks of life. But in my class, we call them Wayfinder soundtracks, right? And I was inspired by my partner, Lassie, who came up with that assignment in her class. And when we're able to center the students like within the space, within their knowledge, that's where I'm able to pick to see like, oh, through their lived experiences, through their Wayfinder soundtrack, it tells me how to go about teaching those lessons, whether it be a Chamorro student from Hayward, or a Psalm 1 student from the city of San Francisco, or a Tongan brother from San Mateo. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm able to pull that from the Wayfinder soundtrack and include it within not just my teaching lessons, but within my interactions with them, like on a day-to-day for the most part. So that's like one example of like how I do it, like from a teaching perspective, right? The other one is like as like the only like a Pacific Islander teacher at my college right now. It's sitting in that seat of when Pacific Islander subject matters like get brought up. It's like, are you gonna leave the seat empty? You know what I'm saying? And just be on the side and be the Pacific Islander professor on the side, or you have to sit in those positions. So a lot of those times, like when those conversations get brought up, like at my school, I'm sitting in them because I'm very aware of like there's a within that discussion, right, there's nobody else to have that conversation. So it's important for me to be in that position to speak on behalf of it. And so that was 3 years ago when I started this position. But 3 years later, I got two of my colleagues that are that are on this call right now. So shout out to Arasi Hamilton and Amalia Sete, who are on the call right now, who work with me at Chabot College to support Pacific Islander students at Chabot College. And so we just got around the same time I got hired, was around the same time that Chabot College applied for an Anna grant. And so, and I wasn't even aware of like, that they were applying for the, right, see, I see you, Ross, in the call. So I wasn't even aware that they were applying for it until my chair of ethnic studies, Kay Fisher, told me that they were having this meeting about it. And so she was like, it's super important. It's a way that we can create a learning community centered around Pacific Islanders. Hayward has one of the largest populations of concentrated Pacific Islander communities in the Bay Area. So it's an opportunity to be a catalyst in that conversation. So I showed up to that Anapisi meeting, and then what was it, a lot of the language that was written like within that like only said Asian American. So it was like super important for me to name like, no, it's, you know, we also support Pacific Islanders over here. So they had to change a lot of the wording like within their proposal to include Pacific Islanders. And then a lot of the learning community components actually was only brought up when I showed up to that meeting. And you know, if it wasn't for you know, Professor Kay Fisher for letting me know that day, you know what I'm saying, to show up to that meeting, like I don't think we would be in the position that we are to create like a Pacific Islander centered learning community at Chabot College. If it wasn't for my colleague letting me know about that meeting, and that's a it's a part of the, for me, it's a part of the mentality of just being aware when the seat is there, or having to create a seat to speak on behalf of your community. I know a lot of this work, and even for me, like it at times felt like super tokenizing, you know what I'm saying, to just always be in this, always have to be in this conversation. But it's just like, you know, when, you know, if there's nobody else, like, you know, how does change occur, you know what I'm saying, for the most part. And that's just been like kind of like what I've been sitting in within my experience. And you know, this past semester, we with the help of Amelia and Arasi, and also our student worker Kayla Taha, we were able to do some amazing outreach on behalf of Pacific Islanders at Hayward, and we're super excited to see what's to come of the next school year, for the most part, because we got funding to plan and work over the summer. And so that's just a couple of ways that it's been showing up, like within my role, like as a teacher, and then on the political / admin side, and working with folks to represent our community.
That's rich, Drew. Thank you so much for sharing that. Jeremiah, how about to you? In what particular context are Pacifica narratives represented, and what might that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, the place that I was born and raised, the Tacoma, Seattle, Washington area, you know, a lot of my cousins, aunties, uncles live there. So that community was always existed, right? Then I decided to go to grad school, and after grad school, the pandemic hit. So I finished my work right when around the time the pandemic hit the US, the COVID-19 pandemic. And during that time, you know, we were trying to build up a chapter of utopia, and utopia stands for the United Territories of Pacific Islander Alliance. It's a network, formal and informal groups, all centered around queer and trans Pacific Islanders, right? And led by queer and trans Pacific Islanders. And actually, the first chapter, or the first one of the founders, Neil, from San Francisco, created that. But Washington was having a huge expansion, Oregon and other places in the state. But then, the COVID-19 happened. A lot of the activity shut down. And then I found myself in the Central Valley because of love. So my then boyfriend and now fiance is from Tulare, and he was here, and so I found myself in the Central Valley. And I remember one of the questions somebody had asked me was like, are you happy in your job? And I was at that time working for a nonprofit organization in Fresno, serving primarily Southeast Asian communities and a couple others. And I said no because I want to find the Pacific Islanders. Like, where are we, right? And it is just not home for me. And what happened was, again, I think me reaching out and then communities just existing but don't have the visibility. It was through a series of conversations, reaching out, being on a similar grant with Epic, who at that time was Tabai, was still with Epic, and we were on the same grant on COVID-19 awareness and testing. So we had an opportunity to chat. She connected us with a couple of people. Another random thing happened is our organization was working with another called Fresno Building Healthy Communities. And I looked on their website, and one of their assistants' name was Bernadine Tuisavalala. And I looked at that name and I was like, okay, that last name sounds Samoan. Like, I'm gonna just take a guess. I'm gonna email her and just say, hey, I'm here. I think you might be Samoan. Do you want to connect? And she was down, right? She said, yes, I am Samoan. Part of my email was like, I apologize if you're not Samoan, but this is I'm going with my gut. Luckily, my gut was correct. So we connected. And that was really the birth of the Central Valley Pacific Islander, right? And we hosted our first COVID-19 vaccination clinic in Fresno, reaching out to Fresno area and really Central Valley area, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. So it was a really cool event. And we were able to give out a lot of grocery cards and a lot of vaccines. And that's where we connected with other Pacific Islanders. And so I think for me, I realized like, okay, there are pockets of Pacific Islanders that exist in the Central Valley, right? I think when we think about California, the Central Valley often does get overlooked, but we have Pacific Islanders in Stockton. We have, Pacific Islanders in Fresno and Bakersfield. So for us, when we came together, it was about connecting those dots, formalizing some of those relationships, and creating this organization that we hope will be responsive to the Central Valley's Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. And so I think for me, and the others who came and kind of, we formed that group, it was addressing this gap, this need, right? The lack of visibility of Central Valley, California Pacific Islanders. I think there's a lot of concentration in the Northern Cal, Southern California, but the Central Valley often gets overlooked. And I think that there's an assumption like, well, y'all don't exist. Truth is we do, right? And we've seen that's existed, that connection we made. And I think I have to also give, in addition to giving a huge shout out to Epic, I've also always been supporters, like Southern California Pacific Island COVID or community response team has been a huge help. Alisi and Carla and others, right, who are on Naki, right? Oh, hi Naki. Others who were on this call kind of have been a big supporter of the Central Valley area. So I think, even before I start talking about the academic side, I think that community side has been always important to me, right? If anything, ethnic studies does not exist without the community. Pacific studies doesn't exist without the community, right? It may, exist in name in some places if you're lucky to have Pacific studies. But for me, that's a huge part of the connection, right? The community, that's a huge part. I think academic wise, like Drew, I was tasked with creating an Asian American Pacific Islander Studies course at UC. Right, this is my second. I'm wrapping up my second year. For my first year, hired as a lecturer. They're like, hey, can you create this class? And I was like, okay, sure. So I put, my head to work, and a lot of the folks that were already mentioned, like Feli Ofa, right, Teresia Tewa, How 90K Track, and then others like Manulali Luli Meyer. Like these names, these ancestors are folks that I was able to bring in to this class. And it's a pretty big task to put Asian American Studies and Pacific Studies into one class, right? And so my goal now has been, okay, we need to separate this because these are two different areas. And so, I think that's also connected to this larger conversation about AAPI or that label, right? AAPI, and the need to really separate that. And you see that in, pop culture. Anyway, I won't go into that. But the academic side, I think that's how I've tried to bring in Pasifika narrative, right? So that students know, like, Hawaii was illegally overthrown, right? They're not just this 50th state of the U.S. That when we talk about U.S. as empire, right, we're going to talk about how the U.S. colonized the Philippines, but also took over Guam and conducted tests, bomb tests, right, nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. One of which was 1,000 times stronger than the bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima. Right? So these parts of history, I think, are important to bring up to the students so that they understand when we say the U.S. as empire, you understand that as a historical context, but also contemporary, right? Because that still exists today. And then I think another cool example, and I have nothing to do with this, but I am so impressed by a school called Mana Academy. If you haven't heard of Mana Academy, they were founded in 2013 in Salt Lake, or in an area of Salt Lake, Utah. And they have a high population of Pacific Islanders, Latin American, or Chicano students. And so, Mana it's a charter school, K-12 school, but they center Pasifika culture, language, dance, history. And so that's I think a really awesome example of not only representing Pasifika narratives, but centering these narratives, these cultures, the language, and what have you. So I think, yeah, those are the answers that I have. I'll stop.
Jeremiah, thank you so much. And let's go to our quick fire response portion of our show. And we'll start with Drew. Drew, should PI studies stand alone from AAPI or A studies? Why or why not? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds to go.
Yeah, just touching up on what, yes, they should be separated and be focused, like, for each community. Just touching up on what Jeremiah was talking about, I think we're doing a disservice, to have to split, what I'm saying, to split the course if it was under the AAPI label. If it was under the AAPI label, it doesn't give enough time, nor is there ever enough time, but still in a course, like, it wouldn't give us enough time to actually focus and center around the community that's actually being taught within that label. The other thing is within my experience at growing up in the Bay Area, it's been so pivotal, like the growth of Pacific Studies programs, like whether it be the minor and the 2 Pacific Islanders scholars at SF State, or the many courses that you see represented within the community college level in the Bay Area. It continues the legacy of the 1968 strike of the BSU and Third World Liberation Front, where back then it was Black, Native, Asian, and Latin students that were talking about, we want courses that represent us and taught by our community. And that's the same push that these courses centered on Pacific folks that were created in the Bay Area. They have the same creation, right? It was organized and fought for by students that said, hey, we want a place in a class to discuss, like the issues that that our communities go through, and ethnic studies is that place where it happens, right? And so it is super important to understand that, like, it is super important to discuss the specific narratives, but also making sure that the space that is being taught in is centered and focused on that particular group. If not, we're just trying to fit in two specific communities that have hundreds of countries and people represented it, and then we have to pick and choose, on what to teach each week for 15 to 18 weeks, right, within a semester. So I'll pass it on to Jeremiah.
Thank you, Drew. Francine, I'm going to give you a choice of two questions. Should PI studies stand alone from AAPI studies? Question option 1. And option 2, what does it look like? What does it feel like for Asian American communities to be good relatives to the NHPI community in ethnic studies?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'll speak to the relatives piece, just because I'm still figuring out the first one, and I think my other two brothers on here have some well thought out reasoning for that, and K through 12, I'm still working on that. But in regards to how our Asian American communities can show up as relatives for our NHPI communities, one of the things I have done with our nearby feeder community college, shout out to San Bernardino Valley College, is they created a Asian Pacific Islander faculty group out of COVID, especially through a lot of Asian hate crimes that were going on. And as they recognize their name as Asian Pacific Islander, they recognize the representation and the lack of representation for their Pacific Islander folks on their campus, let alone their students, and recognizing they had no faculty of our Pasifika background. And so then they started to reach out. And one of the examples of how they reached out is I was already hosting through my nonprofit, an annual event called Island Grad. And they recognized how they hadn't been supporting that, not only us as community partners, but the event alone, let alone the data behind their students who are graduating, who are transferring in, transferring out. And so from that, it held them accountable. It held them accountable to really create that advocacy, that opportunity to connect with me. And I'm grateful for that. Because of that, they saw out what I have been doing. And I think one of the ways our Asian communities can seek out these relationships is recognize what our Pasifika community is already doing, and not overtake, not get involved, and to the point where they create their own way of doing it. Instead, they come under and continue to support the work that we are doing, and ask how to support, how to show up for us. An example of that being, because I host the event on campus, how they can come in and provide that funding, how they can provide that eliminating barriers, bureaucracy, red tape, how they can be the advocates in the classroom to the advocates when it came to finding their students on campus. So when it came to me asking the questions, where's the data on your students, on your Pasifika students? And the data wasn't easily accessible, was already first an opportunity for them to seek. And they've been seeking out and bringing up into their spaces, both as professors, as deans, as coordinators, in many of the roles that I'm working with a lot of those folks. And I would say, the shift really comes in them recognizing what our island community already has to offer, and how our Asian community comes in and supports that and echoes it and helps to move that and brings more folks to understand our community. And then let alone actually helps, literally actually volunteers. Picks up, the work and actually helps us in those moments, in those trenches, provides access to volunteers, provides access to other folks too. I would even say this now, because of that, we have now a Samoan head coach for football. Shout out to Coach Yona and Coach Lecky. They came from Mount Sac, and I know that it was hard because you don't want to take folks, but they really saw the need for our Pacific Islanders in San Bernardino having a lack of representation in many, many platforms. And so they're starting to realize the need to hire our folks and get our people in position. So I think that's another thing, is when you're in those powerful positions, how to really change the game and make sure that you're bringing us into the space, but not only that, actually giving us a space, actually giving us a seat, not even giving to us, giving us the opportunity to have a seat and letting us do our part, and we will do it. We don't need them to do it for us. We just need them to really sometimes just say, hey, we don't have this represented. No. We need a PI. We need our PI folks too. So yeah, that's one example of how I've seen it work so far. And I will say this year has been one of the most successful for Island Grad. And it was because a lot of our Asian community showed up for that day, really in solidarity and really creating that true allyship. And then when, and we know the difference, like the allyship is really key, and also being a co-conspirator and changing some things at the college level, and really calling it out when it's not there, calling it out when it's misspoken, misread, misinterpreted, and addressing that head on. So I think those are some examples of how I've experienced that Asian American folks can be relatives to us.
Francine, thank you so much. And I could go on. I have so many questions to ask, but I want to be respectful of our agenda, and that I want the audience just to go in the chat and just show your love for our panelists, because I thought they were amazing today. So if you could do that for us. And with that in mind, I want to send it back to Estella, or is it Eunice?
It's cool. I'll pick up.
Okay,
thank you so much for moderating, Danny. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you, Francine. Thank you, everyone who's in the chat, dropping all kinds of love and resources. When we were talking about having a panel, I have recently, in my new role out of the classroom and here at Epic, over the last maybe 3 months or so, got to meet each of them at a different community event. Met Jeremiah at our SoCal Picker convening, met Drew up at Cal for the PI Youth Conference that took place there, and recently got connected to Francine, and we met down at PIAM when In Pine was gathering. And each person, as Pasifika folk do, we talk story, and I had a moment with each of them to get to know them and learn more about who they are, where they come from. And every single one of them mentioned ethnic studies. Like it wasn't like I planted something or like that. Each person naturally, that's where our conversations ended up. And so I was excited to reach out and have your voices in this space. I think this is an important conversation that must continue, that must show up in different areas, avenues, venues. It is very clear with the rise of positions available for Pasifika studies, PI educators across the nation, that there's something happening. We are riding a tidal wave here. And Oceania studies, I don't want to say emerging because we've been emerging, but it's very clear that we are a discipline that can stand on its own. And from the folks who are in the chat, I also recognize there's a whole generation of folks who had access to PI studies that are now in positions like you all. And that is super, super amazing and beautiful. I wish I had PI studies when I was coming up. I did have Black studies and it gave me what I needed, but now my kiddo and my daughter, as a Black Pasifika girl, will have both. And I could not be more proud and more excited about that prospect. So all my love and gratitude to you all for joining us today. And Eunice, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Estella. Do we have time for a quick, maybe 1 or 2 questions? Is there anyone from the community who would like to drop a question in the chat, and then see if we have time to answer 1 or 2? And then as they're typing, if anyone's typing, panelists, if you could think of a last couple words to share at the end in terms of either words of encouragement or words to send us off as we continue fighting for ethnic studies for all of our communities. What kind of encouragement would you give us as we move forth? Are there any questions from the community?
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi. Hello, everyone. Great job, panelists. It was really great to hear you all articulate the work that you do. And I'm really grateful to be in this space for everyone who's here willing to, like, be in community with one another. Yeah, I look forward to, hopefully we can connect to see how we can collaborate together, which is, like, a next step. But my question that I have for you all is, what tips do you have for Pasifika educators that want to teach ethnic studies? Or what tips do you have for ethnic studies educators that want to center Pacific Islanders in the classroom?
Drew, Jeremiah, or Francine, anyone want to take that?
I think in my experience, like I was really like the way I got tapped in more into ethnic studies was just looking for professors that sparked my interest, like, within the field. And so I was fortunate enough to just get recommendations right on who to talk to, and that's how I was connected. That's how I got connected to Larry Solomon at San Francisco State University, where he really, he kind of like presented me an opportunity to, or he presented me like other ways on how we can look at ethnic studies from a different lens, whether it be through different forms of pop culture, sports, and comedy. And then the other thing I recommend is looking at your framework, right? The one CPIOS framework that has been super helpful, and it's something that I use, like, within teaching my class at Chabot College. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. There's a question in the chat. We'll do this last question. Is there pushback on the concept of separating out the PI and Asian American studies? If so, what are some reasons?
Well, in a issue, Bakersfield context, I think the only pushback that I got was there wasn't enough time to submit the necessary document to make it happen. So I think, at least at Bakersfield, they don't really have anybody else. So they are more willing to let me do what I think is good and what I think is right. And for me, it's separating those courses. Because what tends to happen in an intro to API, you spend more time on Asian American studies, maybe split on Pacific studies. And I do the opposite. So, we're going to try to separate that, but I don't think there's a huge pushback, at least on the CUC Bakersfield side. And what I've seen, even at CUC Northridge, is there's a position that was created just for the critical Pacific Island Oceanian studies. So if anything, I think it's moving towards that direction.
Awesome, thank you. I want to respect everyone's time. So in the last couple of minutes, panelists, if you could give us one last word of encouragement to send us off as we all continue to fight for ethnic studies in our respective spaces. I think it can be really lonely sometimes for some folks who might be isolated in their context. And it also is really exhausting, the work that we do, but we do it out of love for ourselves and for each other. So what words of encouragement would you give all of us as we go off? Maybe we can start with Francine, and then maybe Drew, and then Jeremiah.
Yeah, sure. I was going to say that to recognize that every fight, it looks different for everybody. As my life partner husband would say, some are bad boys in silence, some are straight radical externally. And I say that because some folks need to do things in the quiet in some ways so that you can be strategic. because we're aware of those around us, and we're aware of the racists that are always watching, always aware of the folks that are just as much trying to see the work so they can tear it down. And I would say that looks different in many different ways. Sometimes it's also to your own personality. And I just want to give people that that form of self authenticity in the way you go about the fight. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly the way others might do it. It may be remnants of the different folks that we study, the different folks right here in this space, and that's okay. It may start small, and then it may go into baby steps, and it may take a lot of patience too, and you may not see a lot of results right away. So that steadfast, I call it that radical patience, that radical patience, even when you are up to your limit on things, how to stay in it the way you and your spirit show up to stay in it. And I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll follow that up with find community, you know what I'm saying? Like, so if the community is not at your institution, not in your neighborhood, like, you know, you have to actively seek them out, whether it be online, you know what I'm saying, through an email. I think Jeremiah mentioned it, like within his experience, you know, he reached out to a couple of folks that were outside of his vicinity, you know, and we're able to do that, you know what I'm saying, because of technology. So that's my approach to it. I'm gonna leave my contacts right here. Just holler at me, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm always down to chop it up. That's actually like my favorite thing to do is chop it up for sure.
Yeah, agreed with the other two have said. And I'll just, put another emphasis on creating communities that you don't see. I think that's the legacy, or that's the reason why Central Valley Pacific Islander Alliance existed, or is in its existence. That's the reason why Utopia, right, the Queer and Trans Pacific Islander group exists, because a lot of people face loneliness, face a lot of discrimination, whether it's from their own community, from those outside, based on race, sexuality, and said, there's got to be a better way. Connected with other people, I think that's also an important thing. You can't do this alone. If you're talking to somebody who's a full person doing it, you probably want to back off a little. But because you need to do this together in a community, like liberated ethnic studies, like ethnic, or like the other groups that are represented here. So for me, it's about connecting, and hopefully, we'll do that, and that will happen from this conversation. If you're watching on a recording, whatever it may be, because it's needed, especially for this critical Pacific Island and Oceania studies institution that I think we should have. So, yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I loved all of your comments in terms of radical patience and organizing, finding community, and also creating community. I'm excited to see what building we can continue to do together as Liberated and Epic and just the ethnic studies community at large. If we can all give them some love in the chat as we sign out, I'm going to play some music for us. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight.